It's on. Okay, so good morning and good evening all. Today we have Akshay Sura and Kamrud Saman with us. They both are partners at Conabos and MVPs from more than 6 to 7 years now. In last session, we had Dennis Augustine with us. He talked about the composable world, and it was a perspective of a strategist. Today we have Akshay and Kamruz with us. They will talk about the same topic, but from a Sitecore architect or developer's perspective. They will talk about their experience, and they will let us know how it look like for a developer and how it will impact their life. So over to you, Akshay and Kamruz.
Perfect. Share. Let's see the screen.
Yep. All right. So thank you for joining us and thank you for having us. Today we'll be talking about what a Sitecore Architect's role is in a composable DXP world. My name is Akshay Sura. I've been an MVP for a few years and I've been part of the Sitecore community as well.
And my name is Kamruz Jaman. I've been an MVP for 10 years and I've been in the Sitecore space for 13, almost 14 years now. So let's start with what is Composable DXP. In the past few years, there's been a lot of change in the Sitecore space, and there's a lot of talk about all the companies that Sitecore have been buying up, these composable, headless related companies. So there's a big move towards composable and the digital experience platform. If we look at the traditional or the monolith platforms such as Sitecore XP, this is where the systems are all in one. So everything is within the same product, within the same all within the same environment and same infrastructure. So when you are building your system, the content management system is in the same system as the presentation layer, the orchestration layer, as well as other built-in functionalities such as the search, the analytics, the personalization. It's all within the same platform, and you're using the vendor's SDK to build your website and your products out. With the composable, what you are looking at is separate products for the separate pieces of the platforms. So you have a system for the content management. You have a separate system for the analytics. You have another system for the personalization, another one for the commerce, another one for the search. And your job is to compose all of these together and build out the final product, whatever you require. And most of the times, these systems are hosted on SaaS cloud-based infrastructure. But that's where the term composable DXP comes from. You are composing the digital experience platform from the various parts and the separate systems. And transitioning to a composable DXP does give you a lot of freedom, a lot of creativity. It allows you to take whatever approach you require to meet the solution of that particular customer, of that particular instance. And more so, Gartner themselves are now pushing for the composable DXP as a future-proof way to future-proof your tech stack. Of course, it allows you to pull out the different systems and replace them with whatever systems you need to meet the needs of that particular client.
Yeah, and going composable doesn't necessarily mean you have to replace everything. There's a lot of reusing your existing applications and technologies as well. So it doesn't necessarily mean you get best of breed for everything. You get, whatever you're missing and you need, you get the best of breed for your own organization. And you don't exactly do it all at once. It's a very agile approach.
Let's spend a little time just talk about Jamstack, because that's used quite a lot within this space as well. So Jamstack stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And it's not a product, it's a modern pattern of architecture for web development based on client-side JavaScript, APIs, and pre-built markup. So the markup being just HTML pages. Generally, it used to be statically pre-generated HTML pages using frameworks such as Gatsby, Hugo, Next.js. You may have used frameworks such as Jekyll previously. It's been around for a very, very long time. Probably one of the grandfathers of this type of static markup generation. And a lot of people used to use it for blogs and smaller sites and things. APIs, you can use APIs provided by a vendor, so using a headless CMS, that might provide APIs to get the content. Elasticsearch has APIs for getting results and requesting results. Cloudinary for DAM, Auth0 for authentication, etc. And then the JavaScript, it could be something like React, Angular, Vue, Svelte. In theory, you can also use something like jQuery or plain old JavaScript, just to call those APIs onto the static markup. But people tend to use one of these more modern frameworks because it provides a lot of other functionality for pre-building your static sites.
And a lot of people talk about cost when it comes to Jamstack and saying it's not as expensive. But what we found based on the experience we have is the cost across the board is actually a lot cheaper. So cost to run it, the monthly costs, including like licensing and infrastructure, cost for developers is much lower because you're not looking for specialized people. There's a lot of front-end developers who you can hire. And then just in general, setting things up from a Jamstack perspective. So I remember we used to run a lot of security scans, and then you get the results back, you run another scan after you fix things. Checking, performance testing, we don't really do that anymore because everything's on the edge and on the CDN, so we don't have to do much of that. The best of all, the developer experience is pretty awesome. So these are all API first, headless first systems where they're documented by default. So when we onboard a new developer, they're up and running in about 10 minutes, and it's super simple. We don't have to set up any like Docker containers or anything of that sort. They pull the repo, NPM, and then they just run it, and it's super fast.
I think one of the nice things that we got into when we first started with this was the learning and documentation is really, really good for a lot of these cloud-based systems. They are API first, so you can't, and they're cloud-based, so you can't like pull a DLL and start using .peek to figure out what's going on internally. So they have to be documented very, very well. A lot of them do have free trials for their cloud services or developer instances, so that makes self-learning very, very easy. Easy to set up an instance, pull the documentation. They have some good sample sites and starter kits that you can pull to start playing around with. So I did find that quite refreshing and a breath of fresh air to just get up and running without requiring licenses and other hurdles to jump through either.
Also, one of the things we want to let everyone know is that one size does not fit all. What that means is, unlike previous, all-in-one technologies, you just once you figure out a stack for one customer or one project, it's definitely not the same stack which you use for another customer or another project. It's all based on the problems you're trying to solve, the technologies you have to work with, you can't just take one and just retrofit it with the others.
Yeah, so in our case, we've been looking at Composable DXP and jamstack since 2018, and we had a lot of customers that weren't using all the functionality in Sitecore. So we were trying to look, what other systems are there that would fit us well, that fit our customers' needs quite well. We looked at like lots of different systems and tried lots of different things. We went through different iterations of other open source technology, and then we eventually ended up on Jamstack, or the Jamstack approach. But yeah, we went through a lot of different systems to figure out which ones worked well, which ones didn't work well, and which ones would fit certain things that our customers were already used to, and which would fill those gaps. So it does take a little playing around and experimentation, especially when you're getting started. But what we were finding was, Sitecore is a very, very feature-rich product, and if people use it properly, then they can get a lot of benefit from there. And it's the main reason people buy Sitecore. They get that nice sales pitch with all the drag and drop, the adding components onto the page, customizing those pages, and then using all the personalization to engage their users. But most of the projects that we had been using, and most of the projects in the wild, are not using most of these features. Most are using just plain old Google Analytics, and if they are using personalization, it's been very, very basic personalization. So it'd be ones that developers had implemented. And personalization itself is a very big process. It's an ongoing process in a project. You can't just implement it at the beginning and lead it. You have to follow through on those. You have to look at the analytics. You have to see which bits of the personalization are working, which bits are not. And it has to be very, very taken very, very seriously. And unfortunately, most of the projects were not doing that. A rough estimate is that 80% of sites aren't using personalization, which is one of Sitecore's biggest strengths.
So what does it mean for a Sitecore Architect in a Composable DXP world? I mean, you have to look at the world a little bit differently. Unlike before, we used to look at everything from a monolith, trying to fix every problem we have with the technology we have. But what we need to do in a Composable DXP world is go outside of our comfort zone. So even though we don't know a piece of technology, we need to look at it that way as architects and say, okay, for my problem, I might have to look at something which I'm never used, which I don't really know of, and think of more things in terms of a very decoupled way, using two or more technologies to make a solution out of it, rather than one solution and you're trying to customize the heck out of it in order for it to fit your problem. You're basically trying to find solutions to your problem using different technologies. So you have to approach it a tiny bit differently than originally. Like, depending on the company you work for, you might have a division just for Sitecore, a division for something else, and you might be restricted to just think and say, okay, you just have to find a Sitecore solution to this problem. It's no longer the case with the Composable DXP.
Yeah, if we take a look at what the role of an architect is, Wikipedia defines it as a software development expert who makes high-level choices and tries to enforce technical standards. So what we had been finding is, from the Sitecore world, most of us have obviously grown up from the development days as developers, but we have typically been working as senior developers / architects rather than just being pure architects. We end up writing a lot of code, but we are also used to working in hybrid tech teams, who have multiple skill sets. You have front-end developers, back-end developers, full-stack developers, DBAs, DevOps engineers, etc. But I think as an architect, we have to look at our role. Should we really be actively coding on the project day to day? Do we really need to know every piece of technology that's being worked on the project? Can we even keep up with all the different technologies? Very rapidly changing world these days. For example, would I need to know React, Next.js, Gatsby? Even within Sitecore, there's so many different technologies, right? There's the analytics, there's the XM, there's marketing automation. There's so many different parts within Sitecore that I can't just know all of them either. So then we need to look at, maybe it's actually better to hire talent that you need for the skill sets that you need, rather than relying on these architects that need to know everything. Instead, fall back to your team members and have them fill the roles of the experts in the technology. And the role of the architect is very blurred. We should be on the lookout for technology that best fits the needs of that particular project and customer, rather than using just the tech that we are most comfortable. So from my perspective, right, I shouldn't just be looking at ASP.NET and C# as the only solution to that particular problem. I should be looking at what is actually going to be the best solution for this specific problem that we're trying to solve.
So what we did is we gathered a few of the architecture diagrams, which we're all pretty aware of and have seen several times. Some of them do have commas, some of them don't. But pretty much what's happening is we have a code repository, we have DevOps, an Octopus deploy or something similar. We deploy our codes to multiple roles. As you can see, the environment looks complicated because we do have multiple roles. And I think with the Sitecore 10, we have even more. But the end goal is the same, as we push it to a CDN, and then our end user accesses that website. And you can repeat this several times, so you can look at it a different way for a different customer. These are all actual customer architecture diagrams. And what you can see is we do a lot of work in Sitecore. We also deal with some external systems. End goal is pretty much the same, which is we push it and the user accesses it. So in our daily roles, what we're doing is, one slide is not good enough, but we could have like 20 of these slides, but we do interact and integrate with other external systems to do a lot of things like personalization or leads or analytics or forms and so on and so forth. So in our world right now, as it stands, every Sitecore implementation does have a lot of integrations with a lot of things. So now if you look at the same architecture diagrams with external services, where we keep everything the same, but then now we show that I am calling an Azure function to do things. I am calling Google Analytics. I'm calling a forms provider or a leads provider. In my mind, it feels like I'm already composable, because am I not doing all the things with external systems and integrating with them? What do you think, Cameras?
You kind of are, right? You're like hybrid composable. So you have a bunch of systems which are composable systems. They're cloud-based, they're API driven, but they're all sitting on top of a monolith. So you get some of the benefits of the cloud of those composable systems, cloud-based composable systems, but you're still being held back by that monolith and all of the downfalls of what that monolith presents. So you still have the on-prem or cloud-based infrastructure. You still have to deal with the upgrades, and still have to deal with everything else that goes with it. So pure composable DXP does have a bunch of advantages which the traditional monoliths don't usually present. They are typically omnichannel. That means that your content, for example, in the content management system can be used across the web, mobile, other devices, and multiple other systems that you want to push that data into and consume that content from. They are typically headless first, and they take an API-based approach. So they're just using REST APIs to access that data. They are typically microservice-like, so they do one thing very well. And they are usually SaaS by default. So they're cloud-based SaaS systems. They're scaled, they're globally scaled, updates are done automatically, bugs are fixed and pushed automatically. The infrastructure is fully managed. You will get new features as of when they are released. So traditional monoliths do not provide those benefits. The composable systems are also technology agnostic. I mentioned that they use REST-based APIs, so they don't care what you use to build your end systems with. You're just consuming REST APIs and then building whatever you like with it. Each of the composable systems is typically best of breed. They do one thing. They do one thing very, very well. They don't do all of that monolith stack that I showed you earlier. The other thing that we really liked is that you can avoid vendor lock with this in two ways. So because they're REST-based systems, you can typically pull one system out and replace it with another one if it doesn't fit your needs or it doesn't do what you thought it was going to do. There may be a little bit of reintegration work because maybe the APIs work slightly differently, but if you use something like GraphQL, you can kind of you can have those data structures be very, very similar. You can obviously abstract away some of the way that you access data as well, just in your own code. So it typically makes it much easier, at least, to remove one system and replace it with another. Whereas in a monolith, you don't have that choice. You have to use what you were given. The other thing is because you don't need as much of this specialized knowledge as you do with Sitecore, for example, then finding an agency partner is also a lot easier because they just need to know how to use headless systems in general. And so being able to find a partner, agency partner, is also much, much easier. So it kind of keeps everybody a bit more honest, both in terms of the partner agencies, but also the vendors themselves, because they know how easy it is to move across state systems. And because of the ability to kind of pull systems in and out as you require, it's also very, very rapid when you need to respond to changing business needs. So if they need to add a commerce system, it's much easier than building out monolith. If they need to add in the analytics or for a different one, or add in personalization, it's a lot easier to add that in and pick from the multiple different vendors that provide these services. There are some disadvantages that obviously go with Composable DXP as well. They are not web specific. I mentioned in the previous slide that they're omni-channel and as an advantage. So it's kind of, so by it not being web specific, what I mean is a lot of the systems that we're used to right now are very web geared, and that's how most content authors have been thinking about things in the past. So you don't have things which are web geared usually. There's things like URLs and slugs, tree structures for paths. These are not typical things in Composable DXP headless CMSs. Typically, a lot of them will work by just having essentially a big bucket of items. And the way you get at the items is by using filters and facets, and that'll give you a list of items that you can then work with. You can get around these by having workarounds and extensions. So it hasn't caused us issues, but it's just something to watch out for when you first start working with these. There are multiple systems and vendors which can essentially give you choice paralysis, especially when you're starting out. As which headless CMS do I use? Which commerce system do I use? Which personalization tools do I use? You will typically narrow those down to a core set that you are probably going to be working with. But if another system came along, they roughly work in the same way, so it shouldn't cause you any problems switching between different systems. But yeah, just initially, it's going to cause you a lot of headache just seeing with demos and shortlisting the systems that work best for you. And none of them have any out-of-the-box functionality. It's just a cloud instance that you're given. But we're kind of used to that in the Sitecore space, because the only thing we get is a welcome to Sitecore homepage. So you will need to build out those sites yourself, but there are usually some samples, starter kits available for some of the vendors that you can use as something to just start off with. You also have to DIY a dashboard and a kind of a launch pad if you're using multiple systems. You don't have the equivalent of like the Sitecore launchpad to get you into the different systems, and it can be quite annoying trying to remember the different URLs, or if you end up with multiple different building out your DXP stack, you will end up with multiple systems. So best to kind of build something simple to at least give them a starting point. And a lot of them, and most of them, will not give you a visual editor. So not many. There are a couple of headless vendors that provide this in the CMS world. There are a few more that are adding this as a functionality, but yeah, you don't have the same kind of thing that you do with the experience editor in Sitecore, where you're able to build and compose the pages. So typically they're a bit more template driven, but again, there's workarounds that we can put in place to give the users some sort of composability in the page.
So now we're looking at the same solutions architecture diagrams, but now with the monolith taken out. Here, what you notice is the same thing. You have a repo. Now we're using something like a Vercel, which is your build, deployment, as well as your endpoint for the CDN, where the website is going to be browsed from. All the external services remain pretty much exactly the same. You don't really touch those. What you do see, though, is you see now Elasticsearch coming into play. Why Elastic? Elastic is one of a good list of search technologies where you can actually use them in anything you want in a headless way. But also you do see quite a big usage of serverless functions. So this becomes like a bigger part, mainly for the .NET developers and the Sitecore architects. This is where all the fun things happen. So you have a static site trying to do a lot of things like trigger builds, talk to things, get things done, deployment hooks and things like that. So the serverless functions do the job for us. So in the next slide, if you look at it, this is again the same architecture diagram as before, but this time we've replaced the headless at like a monolith commerce and a monolith CMS with the headless commerce and a headless CMS. Looks very similar. All the external systems remain exactly the same, but there's a lot of serverless action going on between the DAM and the CDN and the headless commerce and the CMS. So from the CMS, when a page is published, we want to let everyone else know, hey, the page has been published. So to invalidate cache, to do a bunch of other things. From Cloudinary DAM, if you want the images and the public URLs to get updated in the commerce system for products or on the websites, the metadata for the images, all of that is done via serverless functions. We use Azure just because it's the infrastructure we use, and we get to do it in .NET Core. Looking at it from how we approach it. So we typically approach anytime we move anyone to Composable DXP more from a road mapping perspective. We talk to every department, whether they're indirectly or directly affecting the information on the channel you're interested in. So it's a mobile app or a website. And we don't talk about technology at all. So we're basically talking about the business problems they're having, the process problems they're having. what is the issue with the current system. We never look for, okay, I want to take a CMS out, I'm going to put a CMS in, or I'm going to take an analytics provider out, I'm going to put an analytics provider in. We look at it more from a business issue and how we can solve the problem. More often than not, the problem is already solved. So in the business itself, there's a group or a department already which is well versed with, say, a CRM. They use Marketo for collecting data on customers, forms, embedding forms, contact management, emails. So there's really no need to go find another provider if your company is already using it and they're comfortable using that. So there's more chances of you finding a technology which your company already uses. And I think we've said this before. Best of breed doesn't mean the best of breed for the entire world. It doesn't make any difference if it's a best of breed for the entire world. It needs to be best of breed for the organization itself, which means that it needs to fit all the needs for the organization and the problem we're trying to solve. So you need to look at it very from a business architecture level, not necessarily a technology problem.
And if we take a look at the typical life cycle, so with a cycle development life cycle, we typically see a big, like initially a requirements phase, and then we'll go out into a UX phase. We'll build up some wireframes, and they'll get passed on, and we'll have a visual design phase where we'll get all the pretty images for the website. That gets handed over to a front-end dev team, who will start to build out the HTML templates, who will then pass that on to the back-end dev team, who will implement that in Sitecore. And eventually, somewhere before going live, the content entry team works like crazy to populate the site and build out the content pages. And then somewhere way down the line, we'll get that mythical phase 2, where they might work on personalization and adding additional integration within Sitecore. With the composable lifecycle, we can typically shorten it because we can do a lot of these tasks in parallel, even before the website is fully completed. If you think this kind of pattern, this flowchart looks familiar, it's because SXA actually does follow a very similar process to this when you're using the wireframing, for example. So you have a good big, you still have that requirements phase. I actually just mentioned that it's extremely important, this requirements phase. And the UX phase is, we have those typical wide wireframes built out, and then the visual design. And then as soon as that visual design is getting into play, the front-end team, dev team can actually start building that site out. Because it's a SaaS-based system, you just pick your credit card down, you get the instance, the information architecture and the templates can start to get built out straight away. The front-end dev team can actually start to use the templates from the information architecture to build the front-end dev team site, the front-end site out, rather than just building a static HTML site. They can actually build it directly against your SaaS system. Your content entry team, because the content models and the templates are being built, can actually start to enter content straight away. So again, the front-end dev team can be working against real life data rather than lorem ipsum. And because the back-end systems are again decoupled and we use a lot of Azure Function, the back-end dev team can also be working on the pieces of functionality they need simultaneously as well. It's very rapid, it's very iterative, and it's very agile. And then somewhere down the line, when you need the analytics and you need the personalization and you need those other services, you can actually start to add those in when you need them, rather than making your solution and your infrastructure more complex from the get-go.
Yeah, we wanted to quickly cover the content modeling. So content modeling is a new term which you keep hearing more in the headless CMS space. we just wanted to let you know that, this is something as Sitecore architects and Sitecore developers, this is something we do by default. So we look at how data we want to store, data templates, visual templates, how template inheritance and standard values and all that fun stuff, something which we have been doing for a long time. Content modeling is exactly the same. The only difference from a content modeling perspective, specific to Composable DXP, is it's very channel agnostic, in the sense you try to store as much information you possibly can with reuse in mind, without adding channel specific identifiers in the content modeling. I mean, of course, you'll have some templates which will have channel agnostic and channel specific information, but know that you have been doing content modeling for a while if you have been in the Sitecore world. The visual editors, I think Cameron's covered it a little bit. So from a visual editor perspective, what we have, which is the page editor, experience editor, whatever you want to call it, I think it's one of the best page editors you have available. It's complicated. You can customize it as much as you want. You can make it what you like. Yeah, it does have its disadvantages, right? It's slow, it takes forever. It takes a lot of resources. I understand that, but nothing is going to replace a page editor for you in the composable headless world. The very simple reason for that is, from a headless CMS perspective, just the responsibility of the headless CMS is to allow you to store information, and its responsibility is to give you the information when you need it, where you need it. What a headless CMS is not responsible to do is to keep track of how to use this content visually. So just the basic definition of a headless CMS is it'll provide you the information in a channel agnostic, in an omni-channel way, right? How you use it, it doesn't know. Why you use it, it doesn't know. You can use it in a mobile app, you could use it in a POS system. So because of that reason, a lot of the headless CMS do not provide a visual editor. You do have options like Builder.io, StackBit, which are external tools which will let you do that. Some content management systems like Content by Kentico have something like a Web Spotlight, which lets you do it. It lets you do visual editor, but it's never going to be the same as a page editor.
Yeah, it's just a different way of working, and you get used to it. So some of the systems we have don't have any visual editor whatsoever, but you do get quite used to working that way, and it makes sense because they are separate tools. They're not integrated like a traditional monolith system is, where it's hosting the CMS and the content within the same stack. The Sitecore announced during SACOM Europe that they have a new visual editor coming out called Symphony, which is a Sitecore front-end as a service. It will be something that they're building on top of Horizon and on top of their composable sets of products. But it will allow data to be brought in from other external systems such as Contentful or Kentico by Content. So that's quite an interesting one, and they've got a bunch of tools that are being released in this as part of their composable stack, which I think addresses some of the things I had mentioned earlier as some of the disadvantages. So I think it's going to be interesting to see where they go with their new offering. But yeah, I think it's important to note that composable doesn't necessarily mean that it's composable in the page editor. It's just composable within the overall stack. We also wanted to cover what it means to be a .NET developer in the composable world, because this is where both our backgrounds are from. So some of the typical things we've been hearing is, people asking, am I going to be made redundant because I don't know what role I can play as a .NET developer in this space, since all you ever hear about is JavaScript, React, Next.js, and you don't hear that much about .NET Core within the Jamstack world either. Now, the first thing I think it's important to note that jamstack does not mean composable. These are two separate concepts, and you can do one without the other. You do hear about them a lot together, quite interchangeably sometimes. But jamstack is the architectural patterns and principles, whereas Composable DXP is all the different systems to build your digital experience platform, digital experience stack, and bringing those together to be part of your offering. .NET can be a very integral part of your stack and your solutions. We have a lot of .NET developers working on our teams, doing mostly back-end work and using Azure Functions. But a lot of teams are used to working in these kind of multi-skilled teams. If you've worked on any JSS projects, then you'll know there's usually a split between front-end developers and back-end developers, where the front-end developers are using something like React or Angular to build out the sites, and the back-end developers are working on Sitecore and building out custom resolvers and any other customization that you still need to make in your typical Sitecore systems. The other important thing to note, of course, is before we started working on Sitecore, we were all just agnostic developers. I was always a .NET or a Microsoft Stack developer, but we were typically building systems out and not just content management systems. So being agnostic, of course, is also good in this world, because it will also actually open up job opportunities for you, rather than being just pigeonholed into Sitecore, into the Sitecore space. But you can create composable solutions using whatever languages you like, technologies. I mentioned earlier that they are headless, REST-based system, API-driven systems, typically just using REST-based APIs. You can see a lot of examples from different vendors using JavaScript, .NET, Java, Ruby, PHP, but it's just a REST endpoint. You can use whatever you like. You can also build jamstack sites using static. So these are statically generated sites. So typically, there are some advantages of using JavaScript-based frameworks, but there is a framework called Static, which I think for .NET developers the concepts will be quite familiar. For Sitecore developers, the concepts will be quite familiar, because they have the concepts similar to Sitecore, where we have pipelines and processes. Static uses pipelines and modules. So you put a document into the pipeline, it goes through a number of modules and then modifies that document and enhances it however you need, and it spits out a static HTML site. Now, we had played with this site. We had actually looked at this as one of our very first ways of trying to build out jamstack sites, because we're .NET developers as our past. But there are a lot of advantages that we found in JavaScript-based frameworks. So we ended up using Next.js, because you could switch between static site generation, server-side rendering, or they have a feature called incremental static regeneration, where the page isn't pre-built. It's just built on the first request, and then it's cached. Hosting was also a lot easier, because we could use something like Vercel and Netlify, which would do both the build, the deploy, and the hosting, and the scaling, and everything else that they provide benefits with. With Static, we had to handle that all manually, deploying into Azure, for example. And the other thing that we had issues with is the static site generation works really, really well for small sites. We have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 pages. But as soon as we push that onto a headless content management system, those 50 pages can quickly become 200 pages, which can quickly become 5,000 pages, especially if you're using commerce. So went from building the site out in 30 seconds to 2 minutes to then like 2 hours almost, because it was just statically generating the entire site and every single change, even on the content side, right? So somebody makes a change to the homepage, it goes and rebuilds everything. So the build times can go quite crazy. So just be aware when you're using something like static or static site generation that this will be a problem. And this is a problem that incremental static regeneration solves. And that's one of the reasons we ended up going with Next.js as our preferred framework. You can build your own .NET Core applications, of course, and just serve it in the traditional way that any typical website would be hosted or application would be served. You can then layer a CDN on top of that to cache the pages, and then you can add a custom layer and custom hooks on your content management system to clear the caches as required. But obviously, just be careful with how you validate caches, because that's always a bit of a tricky one.
Yeah, and also just remember what we had mentioned is going this route into a more composable DXP headless space lends itself to a lot of .NET development, if that's what you choose to do, right? So there's a lot, imagine all the processes you used to do to pull and push data, to do things, to trigger things. All of those would have to be done using .NET code, either in Azure Functions, or you can do it in either Azure. If you want to do it in .NET, you can do it either in Azure or AWS Lambda. If you want to do it in any other kind of Azure functions, like a PowerShell function or a node-based function, or anything based on, say, Next.js, for instance, there's several other options available, right? So if you do it on Vercel or Netlify or like Cloudflare, you could write them in the language you're using the website for. AWS Lambda lets you do it in multiple languages, so does Azure Functions. So remember that as a .NET developer, you still have a lot of work to do in order to do things, and those are all done through serverless functions.
Yeah, and if we take a look at the page request life cycles and how they've changed, so in a typical Sitecore kind of site, a request comes in, it then may go through a load balancer or a CDN, gets passed to the server, and Sitecore then process that request, or load up its load the item, or load the page layout, then load in all of the components, and then process each component one by one. Those components could call out to custom databases or other external services, or even on the custom application. And Sitecore will then build out an HTML page and then return that to the customer, to the user. You can obviously try and use CDN to try and speed some of that and cache parts of that out as well. The lifecycle, the typical lifecycle with jamstack based sites is a request comes in and there is no processing. The HTML is returned from disk, or if you're using something like Next.js, from its cache through incremental static regeneration. If you then need to supplement the data on that page, you will use the REST APIs. You make a call essentially via JavaScript to the REST APIs, to your composable service, or maybe even to an Azure function if you need to do something custom, or pull out to custom database, or maybe return some account information for that particular user, and return that to you will return that via JavaScript, but in the API call, and then that will then do something with that data and display it on the HTML page. So all the dynamic functionality is actually moved away from the server and essentially onto the front end via REST API calls. You might have been doing some similar things for parts of your kind of traditional CMS, like Sitecore systems. So for example, if you had a search page, that might just be a very plain search page with nothing on. And then it's, you use your REST APIs to call out to the search endpoints to return the results, and then, display that on the page. And then, when you page for the next set of results, you're calling back out to the REST API and then displaying that back on the page. So some of the concepts will be familiar, but I think the main thing to note is the HTML response is the same to every single user, regardless of which country they're from, if they're logged in or not logged in, if if they visited the site before, they haven't visited the site before. Everybody gets the same response, and then any dynamic functionality is done via REST API, of course. So kind of wrapping up, they say that the only constant in life is change, and in IT, it's guaranteed. It's never a case of if, but really is a case of when. I think we've been kind of fortunate in the Sitecore space that the core CMS functionality hasn't changed in a long, long time, but Sitecore has recognized that change is coming. So they released things like XP. So when I first started with Sitecore, there was no XP; it was just Sitecore CMS. So they added in the analytics, and then other functionality came like EXM and JSS and marketing automation. So the change has always been there. I think we've kind of grown up with it a little bit over time, so we probably haven't noticed it as much. But I think it's important to find your stack, find a set of technologies and products that work for you and work for your team. And a lot of these concepts, just mentioned the search page and that kind of thing, but we saw some of the typical architecture diagrams earlier. We have been doing a lot of these things already all along anyway. It's important to focus on the client and the project needs and not the technology. That's really going to be key for making this change, this move more of a success. And of course, we're all going through the same thing. So reach out to the community, reach out to us if you have questions or want a bit of advice. But yeah, change is coming. You just need to prepare and figure out what's going to work for you and your teams. And yeah, if anybody has any questions, and I'll answer them.
There's some in the chat, so I'll start with the first one. So does Solar have any JavaScript library? Actually, it does. SearchStacks has a front-end library which you can use, just like how Coveo does and all the other providers do. Pretty much all of them do, where you're making a call on the client browser. It makes a call, gets the search results, and renders it on your page. So yes, they do have that. Some of the more advanced search technologies do have libraries specific to whether you use React or Angular or Next or Gatsby, but it truly depends. There's a couple of questions. I'll try to answer it as delicate as possible. So according to Sitecore's own words in SACON EU, they understand that they're in a composable DXP world. They understand that they would have to work with other competitors in similar spaces like content or contentful. So it is natural for you to mix and match technologies as you see fit for a possible solution. So you could have Content by Kentico as the headless CMS. You could use AutoCloud as the commerce system. You could do Sitecore Personalize as something, Marketo as something else, maybe use Sitecore Send. So doesn't necessarily mean all products would be Sitecore, but they would be a mix and match of other vendors in between, because one vendor can't really produce all products which the customer would want or would fit the need. So that's something which is super important for us to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is what we have been finding is on some of the projects we have been working on is the customers already had a set of products that they were already using in one part or all part of the organization. And that could be something like Marketo or a commerce system or a DAM or a PIM, or something like that. So if a customer is already using something and that's working well for them, if we had been doing this in Sitecore, it's, hey, I know you're using this and this works great for you. you need to now move it all across into Cycle, which had been a big, big lift for, it takes a lot of work and effort and change for an organization. So if they're already using something, why not use it? Why not continue to use it if it's working well for them? You don't have to then do migrations and that kind of stuff. So Cycle does recognize that, and they will play nicely with any system. They are composable at the end of the day. So you compose them as you want in this new world. So Composable DXP, do we use, so also with Composable DXP, do we use Sitecore's inbuilt personalization, or with its introduction, Sitecore's inbuilt personalization will become obsolete? So with Composable DXP, no, you won't use the Sitecore's inbuilt personalization. Sitecore does have a new product called Sitecore Personalize, or you can use something like Uniform or Concierge, which are headless composable systems in their own right for the personalization. Even in Sitecore's move going forward, they're recommending in the kind of the old X platforms, even Sitecore themselves are recommending you use something like Sitecore XM and not Sitecore XP. And of course, Sitecore XM doesn't have the personalization at least to the same level as XP. I know it has some personalization, but they recommend not using personalization within Sitecore, the old Sitecore CMS, and then using the composable systems such as Sitecore Personalize to do the personalization if you need it. But again, use it when you need it and don't add it in from before. And the final question there is, now there are multiple Sitecore products available, CDP, or the cloud, Content Hub. Does this mean that there will be now platform experienced developers, like a Sitecore CDP and personalized developer or the cloud developer? Yeah, what do you think, actually?
Yeah, it's inevitable, right? I think in your own words, you've said it before, not all of us would know everything. So we would have to depend on others to be specialty developers in Auto Cloud, and then you would do one part, they would do another part. So yeah, I think it's only natural that not everyone's going to know everything. Not every Sitecore product anyways. That's the case right now. Like, I don't know Auto Cloud, and I haven't worked with CDP yet. I know a little bit of Content Hub. I know like the core product, obviously, but yeah, I think it's a natural thing to be.
Yeah, I think the good thing about this though is because these are all API-based systems, they'll be very well documented. It typically will mean that if you worked with a headless CMS, then switching over to Content Hub, for example, is going to be, or Content Hub headless, which is going to be their new system coming out, right? It's going to be very, very similar, and the switch will be very easy. Again, same with Auto Cloud. I don't want to jinx it, but even if you've never worked with a headless commerce system, if you understand the core concepts of e-commerce and commerce development, it will be very easy for you to pick up Auto Cloud if you've worked with an API-driven system before, as opposed to moving over to Sitecore Commerce, the old commerce system, which was a completely different ballgame. It was using a completely different SDK. It worked kind of similar, but very differently to Sitecore XP. It will be a much easier transition from an API-driven system to Auto Cloud than it would be from XP to Commerce, for example. And the other thing I'll just mention is, even within Sitecore XP, even though it was a single product, I don't know anybody who professes to be an expert in all of the parts of that product anymore. If I was to do something with EXM, which I avoided because it was crazy, there's very few EXM experts in the Sitecore space, and there's very few marketing automation experts. There's very few analytics experts. People kind of know a little bit about them, but not in that specialized kind of way, which you typically think about when it's separate products.
Yeah. I think that was all questions in the chat window. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having us. Have a good rest of your day.
Yeah. And
Thank you,
thank you.
everybody.
Yep. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye.